that's just a summary of Richard Wright's life. The literary side to this is we can start with the plot. The first part of the plot is the exposition. Richard and his family, they didn't have a lot of money, and whatever they did have, that was just enough for them to get them by. Richard was also a troublemaker at home. As I just previously stated, when he lived with his grandmother was very religious and he wasn't. So they started to clash, and he started to be a bad child. Also, in the beginning of his life, Richard burned down his house with fire because of a conversation that his mother and his father had with Richard, and he didn't like the decision that was going on, so he burned down the house. Leading up to the climax of his life, Richard's dad abandons his family. Richard's dad abandons his family, so his mom tries to get a new job to provide and trying to fill in his dad's place. However, that was not possible. So since there's only one person in the house that's trying to bring in all of the finances that both people are trying to bring in, they begin to starve and they begin to be hungry because there's not enough food or not enough money to provide for the food or to get the food. Also, Richard becomes an alcoholic and he starts to face racism. The peak of his life is when Richard moves to the north, where he can be free and he can see different parts of the world and base his whole outlook of the world in the north, because the north was quote unquote better than the south. And also, that was him moving to the north was an opportunity for him to become a writer. Also, when he moved in the north, his family and him, they were better off and they were very happy living in the north rather than the south. However, that's just the good side of Richard Wright's life. During that time, the Great Depression and wars and all of the tragedies started to happen. So Richard begins to lose his job. He has to move to a worn down apartment because he couldn't pay for his apartment that he had, and he joins the Communist Party. And when he joined the Communist Party, he experienced racism and even more poverty because he didn't have money. However, the resolution to his life and the book is that Richard is doing what he loves to do, which is becoming a writer and writing and learning more about himself and other people around him. The major characters in his life was himself, of course, because the book is about him. Ella Wright, which is his mother, she's a major character because his mother was basically the only person that he looked up to in his life. Since his father was not there when he was young, his mother was the only adult around other than his grandparents that he actually loved and cared for. His granny is a major character in the book and in his life also because she, even though she was very religious and he wasn't, it showed him that there were going to be obstacles in his life that he really did not like. Also, another major character is his aunt. His family and him, they moved everywhere, as I stated before. They moved with his aunt, and she was very influential in his life, especially her husband, Aunt Addie's husband, because he showed Richard in a short amount of time how to be a man and how to live up and to do what you want and to do what you want to do. And I also think that his father is a major figure in his life, even though he was not there. His father showed him how things may not go as planned, and how you also need to work around situations. In the book and in his life, Richard is in a time period. He was born in 1908. So he was born in 1908. So when he grew up, Richard he was born in 1908. So he was born around the time when there's the progressivism. During that time, there was World War I that was going on, the Great Depression, and political reform. World War I, as we all know, was a tragedy, and there were many outcomes that were negative that affected the United States. Great Depression was also affected in Richard Wright's life, because it shows how the climax of his life, where he moved to the north and was better off, how the Great Depression, when the Great Depression happened, it affected his life, and he lost his job and had to move to a different house or to a different apartment. Also, culturally, the Jim Crow laws was in his the Jim Crow laws was happening also. Jim Crow laws are basically racism and separation of races. So that plays a part with his life, because since he was African American, he was probably since he was African American, there probably was racial slur that was said to him, and he probably was not treated the same as whites were, or anyone else that wasn't African American. Also, there's the economic war. Richard Wright was in poverty ever since Richard's dad left. The family had been in poverty because his mother was the only one to provide for them, and that wasn't really much. Also, when the Great Depression was occurring, Richard Wright was in poverty because the finances wasn't as good as they were. Also, another economic error was hunger. There was a shortage of food in Richard's life, and he became very poor to where he had no money. In the book, there are various themes that one sees. For one, racism. Richard was judged for the color of his skin. He was judged because he wasn't white and he was African American, and he was a victim of the Jim Crow laws. Also, another thing would be man versus society. Richard was, in his life, he was trying to understand why there was such hatred and racism in the world. Since Richard is an African American, there was racial slur said to him. He didn't understand the reason why there was so much hatred in the world, and he didn't understand why, as a country, we couldn't all come together and be one. And another thing would be hunger, physically and mentally. Physically, he was physically hungry because there was no finances, and he was living in the South, and there was a Great Depression and poverty. Mentally, he was hungry for knowledge. He wanted to learn more, and he wanted to do more. He wanted to be a writer, and he wanted to branch out and become the best that he could. Also, a literary device that was shown in the book is, again, hunger. hunger can hunger symbolize a lot of things, mentally and physically, as I just stated. The novel I think is very outstanding. I like the novel because it showed how African Americans were treated back then, and it also affects African Americans today, and not just African Americans, however, the whole society today, because it shows how back then there was so much hatred in the world to where there was lynching and there was ways to stop African Americans to becoming a whole person as a white person. I think this novel is a part of history because it shows how I think this novel is a part of history because it shows how a poor black man can have so much ambition and be so inspired by white people. However, the law and other white people are not allowing him to live up to his own potential. Black Boy shows how he Black Boy shows how he was in poverty and he then became well off. However, since there was the Great Depression, he went back to poverty. I think this novel was very good, and I liked the reading, and I liked the novel, and Richard Wright was a very good, and Richard Wright was very, and Richard Wright's life was very influential to me, and Richard Wright was very influential to me. Thank you.